Welcome to DCJ's podcast. The Division of Criminal Justice is within the Colorado Department of Public Safety. This podcast is dedicated to sharing the stories, insights, and experiences of those who work tirelessly behind the scenes to improve public safety, policy, support crime victims, and build stronger, more resilient communities. We'll dive into the challenges and triumphs that come with building a safer future for all who call Colorado home. Thank you for tuning in. We're thrilled to have you join. I'm Matt Lunn, Director of the Colorado Division of Criminal Justice. Here at DCJ, we have a number of boards, and each board works in collaboration with our staff to advance outcomes for the communities we serve. In our state, government boards don't just exist forever. They are regularly audited to ensure their work is serving all those who call Colorado home. In this episode, we are discussing DCJ's Domestic Violence Offender Management Board. When we talk about domestic violence, we're talking about safety, we're talking about accountability, and we're talking about systems that have to work. In 2027, the board faces what's called a sunset review. And today, we're discussing what the board has accomplished, the data behind our new safety tools, and why this sunset review is a critical moment for every Coloradan. Joining me are Jesse Hansen, who manages the board's program and is our program manager for the Office of Domestic Violence and Sex Offender Management, Vice Chair of the board, Aaron Gazelka, former Chair and Prosecutor Stephanie Fritz, and board member and victim advocate, Jessica Fan. Let's start with the foundation. Jesse, you manage the Office of Domestic Violence and Sex Offender Management. Before we get into the sunset legislation, can you give our listeners a little bit of background on the Domestic Violence Offender Management Board, how our teams work with the board, and why we're even talking about a sunset?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's good seeing you, and we're very grateful to be able to be part of this podcast. So the Domestic Violence Offender Management Board exists within the Office of Domestic Violence and Sex Offender Management in DCJ. And coincidentally, we actually just celebrated our 25th anniversary last year as the DVOMB was created in 2000. And unfortunately, not a lot of people in our state know about the wonderful things and the wonderful asset that is the Domestic Violence Offender Management Board. It exists for the protection of victims. Bottom line, how it does that is really important in that it sets standards for the evaluation, treatment, and behavioral monitoring of individuals who are convicted of a domestic violence offense. And why that's important is very much traceable back to its roots, because prior to 2000, when there wasn't a DVOMB, it was kind of a dysregulated model where different counties oversaw the approval of individuals working in this space. And I can confidently say that what we know from the research and literature, and even from best practice in the existence of the DVOMB, is this is a very specialized field. And that is those who are working with those who are causing harm to those that are serving on our board. There's a lot of knowledge and expertise that goes into this. And it's really exciting to kind of see how the evolution of the board and its standards has come through over the past 25 years. Setting the stage for sunset, it's always kind of the looming thing that boards have to experience, because honestly, it's always a question where a board may not be continued. And I think that's honestly a strength for our state, because we don't want boards to live in perpetuity or to have dysfunctional statutes. Having the ability to reflect, look back, and see what is going well, what's not going well, is really an opportunity to see where things might be enhanced or things might be better. And I think that inflection point really comes on the heels with the last sunset review, where the board was mandated to do some certain things. I'm sure we're going to get into those, whether it's the standards compliance reviews or the data that we're collecting. But there's a lot of great things that this board does. And I'm hoping that whether it's through this podcast or through the sunset review, that gets a little bit more broadcasted to our partners statewide.
So Jesse, thanks for that information. And you touched on something that I think is really important associated with the sunset review. And it's kind of this idea of a mandatory performance review for the state. This comes up in a lot of different contexts. I was down at the Capitol last week, and we were talking about the sunset of the cold case task force that's run out of the Colorado Bureau of Investigations. And I think oftentimes these boards and commissions are really important. They do such important work. And so people sometimes ask the question of, well, why would we even have a sunset? Why don't we just get rid of the idea of a sunset every 5, 10, 15 years? And it really goes back to this idea of taking a look at what's working and where there's opportunities for us to continue to advance the work and the mission of the office and the professionals around the state. When you hear questions, Jesse, from members of the General Assembly, what are they generally asking as it relates to the Domestic Violence Board or domestic violence in general?
I think they have a lot of salient questions thinking through what has happened in our state, especially since COVID. We're seeing increasing rates in domestic violence, and there's been a number of efforts to try and reconcile and understand what has led to that dynamic. I think when it comes to the DVOMB's role in that constellation of the government services, specifically the criminal justice systems that are in play, the DVOMB is a primary role in the rehabilitation of individuals who have been convicted. And their primary question is, does treatment work? And what we typically run into is questions around, efficacy, what are the recidivism rates, but generally they all fundamentally come down to, does treatment work? And we're confident in knowing that it does. What makes Colorado unique in a lot of different ways is we don't have a one-size-fits-all system. I think Director Lunn, that we've presented in a number of different contexts how we have a differentiated treatment model based on risk, need, and responsivity. And why that's important in answering that question to the folks over at the Capitol is that the question of, is domestic violence offender treatment effective, is kind of a setup to be able to have to answer that in a dichotomous yes or no format, when really you have to look at this population with a lot more nuance. And it's really a question of which interventions work best for which populations. And so our standards are set up so that more high-risk individuals are going to get a higher dosage and intensity of treatment. They're going to get additional adjunct services that address any co-occurring issues. And so there's a much more holistic approach to addressing a lot of other needs, in addition to coercive control and power and control dynamics that are happening. And that's really important, because when a victim opens the door asking for help and services, we should be meeting clients where they're at, and not exactly how the system has constructed it for them to arrive perfectly at our doorstep. And I'm happy to say that we have incredible therapists that do this work, and they do amazing things to really incorporate best practices and research-informed ways of working with clients that I had no idea existed before I jumped into this role, it's really, really impressive.
Yeah, I've definitely been impressed. I always enjoy attending the board meetings when I can and getting to interact with the professionals that work in this space. And I'm continually impressed by the work they do day in and day out, and their victim-centered approach. And Jesse, thank you so much for setting kind of the stage perfectly for this conversation. Creating a uniform standard across the state is so important in this space and in so many others. But standards only work if the people in the courtroom actually trust them. The system actually trusts the standards and the process. Stephanie, as a prosecutor, how did moving away from a one-size-fits-all model to a specific risk level buckets change the way a judge or a DA might look at domestic violence cases?
Well, Director Lunn, thank you for having me. It was my honor to be able to represent prosecutors on the board for about 8 years. And I learned a lot about offender treatment, and I became a better prosecutor because of it. So I came from New York, where in that system, it was the one-size-fits-all approach that Jesse spoke of, where no matter the risk level of the offender, they were set to do a certain number of classes, and it was just treated as a checkbox. There was no real thought of victim safety and offender accountability. And through my time on the board, I learned that this is really, really dangerous. To place low-level offenders who maybe are using situational violence with high-risk offenders who are using much more lethal means of coercive control, such as strangulation and stalking. We don't want low-level offenders to become higher-risk offenders. What I think I've learned, and what prosecutors and judges should know, is that the DVOMB is constantly refining this process. They are looking at research. The risk assessment tools that I believe Aaron is going to speak on are validated. And what that does is ensure that we're treating an offender for the underlying causes of their use of violence, but most importantly, ensuring a victim accountability. And judges can rest assured that when they're sentencing someone to offender treatment, that it's going to be the same throughout the state, and that the real crux of the issue is going to be addressed.
So you touched on this a little bit, Stephanie, and what do you hear from fellow prosecutors as it relates to the application of the standards? And How do judges receive this information? What's their level of comfort with the DV standards and how it relates to appropriate sentencing for offenders?
I think one thing is that knowledge of what DVOMB does runs the gamut from prosecutors and judges to very educated about what DVOMB is doing and maybe not so educated. Some judges still believe that it's a 36 class approach, where others are much more in tune to what's occurring within offender treatment. And that's one thing we work really hard on as a board as a whole, is we go out and we educate the stakeholders. We spend a considerable amount of time educating folks about the risk and responsivity model of treatment, about that second contact that Jesse spoke of. And I know when prosecutors learn about that, it opens up their eyes and they're so comfortable and excited to know more about treatment. I also think an important component of DV offender treatment, and Jessica, I believe, is going to speak on this, is the importance of the victim advocate on the MDT, on the multidisciplinary team, because not all victims are going to leave the relationship for complexity of reasons. They might remain. And it allows us to educate victims about what to expect with offender treatment and know that there's another line of defense of, again, safety for a victim, that they are able to communicate with the treatment advocate. And again, it really ensures that individualized approach to treatment for each offender. And a great deal of work has been done to develop that.
I think oftentimes I think of the state's role, regardless of what the public safety challenge is to build out frameworks for success. And I think to some degree, I think of standards in this space as creating those frameworks for success, right? For individuals who have offended, for prosecutors and judges for what to expect as part of the process, and if somebody is sentenced to treatment, and then kind of an understanding. We'll get to this a little bit when we talk about advocacy for survivors in this space. But can you talk maybe a little bit, Stephanie, about, or how do you think about the standards as a way of building in consistency for judges and prosecutors?
One thing I can tell you about all judges is that they want to ensure victim safety and offender accountability. But judges and prosecutors, we're not the experts in providing treatment. So we need to make sure that there is a consistent system where the experts who are able to give that treatment that promotes offender accountability and victim safety is the same throughout the state. We don't want an offender in Southern Colorado to be treated differently than an offender in the metro area. And so by having this statewide board, judges can know that it's consistent, that it's evidence-based, and that it's done with the center of victim and community safety.
Yeah, I love that. You make such a good point about judges. And I think sometimes people have this belief that all of our judges or all of our prosecutors or all of our defense attorneys have this expertise in every case that comes before them. But oftentimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, oftentimes they're really relying on the experts that come in and provide testimony as part of the case, and also the standards that are developed either by local, state, or national organizations to help guide some of these decisions. And I think more broadly, what's your experience been in prosecuting these cases? How has domestic violence and the treatment of individuals and survivors in this space, how has that changed over your time as a prosecutor?
Well, I've been a prosecutor for 20 years. And like I said before, and when I was at the Brooklyn DA's office, it was that cookie cutter approach. We were just learning more and more. We didn't go forth wanting to do harm, but we just didn't know as much as we know now. And even when I joined the board, I've learned a tremendous amount from relying on the experts, from learning from Jesse, Aaron, and Jessica about what treatment is and how we are approaching it in Colorado and how we're really a national model. Because, and it goes back to Sunset Review. It's because we're always constantly examining who we are, making sure that we're doing it in the best way possible. And so I've been able to learn a lot and then bring it to my fellow prosecutors, where we've done trainings at our statewide conference. We've done trainings in individual offices to really educate And so that prosecutors understand how this model exists and how it's really tied to a lot of the lethality assessments that prosecutors are familiar with. The lethality for homicide, they're closely tied with the offender treatment. And so that's one way that we bridge the gap in education.
You know, Stephanie, you've addressed this to a degree, but I think it's so important for folks to understand that people aren't static, right? Their offenders aren't static in their risk. They're not static in their needs, and that their behavior changes over time. Aaron, that leads us directly into the Cascade pilot. How does this tool allow us to look at an offender's behavior today using those risk, needs, and responsivity principles rather than just judging them by a particular point in time?
The Cascade's been such a huge lift, and I think a really exhilarating one when I look back at the last several years on the board. It is newly named. It has its roots in an assessment that the DVOMB developed, the Domestic Violence Risk and Needs Assessment. That's the DVRNA. So as its revised version, it got renamed. In terms of thinking about the Cascade and its roots, what's nice about this revised assessment and what the board's been working on in processing it is creating a tool that utilizes static and dynamic risk factors exactly to what you were just speaking about. That there's a static portion of the Cascade that allows us to just look at someone's history to assess an initial look at risk, low, medium, or high. But then there's this whole dynamic risk scoring section of the Cascade that allows providers and supervising agents and the victim advocates as part of the MTT working in concert to look at how dynamic risk factors decrease over time as we watch the treatment work. I think that's one of the things that has stood out to me as a huge milestone for the board in the last several years, is watching the DVRNA become validated, knowing how much work went into that, knowing that it demonstrated how they set up the DVRNA initially. They kind of got it right, developing us into these level A, B, and C buckets, as you were just talking about with Stephanie, and that what we're doing is actually reducing risk. So that's a really incredible thing to see as we validated the DVRNA, and now we're creating this more useful, more elegant tool that allows us to look at static and dynamic risk factors and better facilitate MTTs making decisions about when someone's done with treatment, when those risk reductions have actually occurred. There's really so much more I could say about it. I am a big fan of the Cascade.
And Aaron, it might be actually helpful. I know we'll have a lot of folks that are listening in that have a level of expertise in this particular field. For our audience in general, could you maybe just take a half step back and let us know some examples of maybe some static risk factors as well as some dynamic risk factors and how those might change in someone's life over time?
For sure. So when we talk about static factors, we're talking about things like a client's or offenders, depends on who you're talking to, but I'll use the term client. It looks at how a client's criminal history, indeed it's domestic violence specific history, and things like protection order violations or features of the actual offense play into level of risk. And so when I think about the DVRNA's roots, it was developed looking at the danger assessment tools and what was available in the research in terms of what are deemed, risk factors for domestic violence behavior. And, that's where the static risk factors sort of come from. Dynamic risk factors, on the other hand, are really about stuff that a client can change. It's the things that we can see change over the course of treatment. And in criminogenic therapy specifically, these are things like their antisocial attitudes. So it's a little bit of a term of art in the research world and the assessment world. You could think about that here with regards to domestic violence as like pro-abuse belief systems or belief systems or thinking that supports using violence against an intimate partner. That's the stuff that we see change over the course of time and treatment. We'll also see a number of factors in dynamic, the things that allow us to individualize a treatment plan. So things like substance abuse, mental health, histories of trauma and intergenerational trauma and how those affect their thinking and their belief systems and choices today. So that's what we're working on in treatment. And so having a dynamic portion of an assessment tool is extremely helpful for clinicians to be able to see, engage whether that risk is coming down, whether the changes are occurring. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. It's incredibly helpful. And I think it might also be helpful for our listeners to understand, from your lens as a clinician, what are some characteristics or factors that are unique to DV clients that might not be present in kind of a broader population?
That is $1 million question. In terms of the assessment world and the number of assessment trainings I've been to, that's sort of an ongoing issue in the realm of domestic violence assessment. Is those of us that work with domestic violence clients know that there's domestic violence specific behavior. The assessments that are developed in the DV world as compared to, say, the sex offense specific world are sometimes doing a better job of gauging the central 8 criminogenic needs. I know I haven't ventured into the realm of risk, need, and responsivity yet in talking. We call it R&R for short. But like traditional domestic violence assessments and some of what's out there just sort of scrape the surface at pulling up basic criminal factors and aren't highlighting DV specific behaviors well. I think that the Cascade is stepping in that direction of trying to identify DV specific behavior. I have a lot of opinions from working with DV clients about, what is DV specific, but in general, it's things centered around the concept of power and control, how people are utilizing power, what's happening with their locus of control. If we step away from criminogenic needs generally, that's what we're typically talking about. And so I want to make sure to lose sight of your original question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. And, you touched on R&R. Can you talk about R&R and how that relates to the evaluation and treatment? And really, guys, what I'm trying to get at is how does that translate into better community and survivor safety?
Yes, I ordinarily train 2 to 4 hour segments on R&R. So in the briefest form possible, risk, need, and responsivity is sort of a research tenet that arose out of work by Andrews, Bonta, and Gendro, some Canadian researchers who responded to some initial meta-analyses that were saying what we do in the system doesn't work. And what they found is that for what Jesse was speaking to a few moments ago, if you actually match risk to what is the treatment dosing and the level of supervision and monitoring and treatment, that you actually get much better results. And we're doing a lot more work to reduce recidivism. So that's where R&R comes from. It's extraordinarily important. Sometimes in reviewing how people criticize this tenant, or there's new criticisms to it today, they often seem to be suggesting that it's too formulaic. And I think that that's baseless. In terms of R&R's roots, its guiding principle is the idea of individualization, which is what Jesse's talking about. So in terms of how R&R translates into community and victim safety, the other importance of understanding these 3 concepts is ensuring that you're addressing someone's risk, you're assessing what level of risk they're at, and then you design treatment at a dose for that level of risk that meets their criminogenic needs, which is their reasons for committing crime, while also simultaneously addressing any treatment needs that are responsivity issues. So things that could impede their ability to make progress on treatment needs. Tying all 3 of those pieces together and truly individualizing treatment plans is the thing that leads to the most reduction of recidivism for clients, domestic violence clients, and general criminal clients, relatively speaking.
And this question might not make sense, so feel free to just disregard altogether. But you touched on it there right at the very end. And my question was related to how does the appropriate dosage improve lives for the clients? I guess maybe my question might be based on your recent comments. What's the reaction from clients? Does that make sense? Who have this more individualized approach? What does it mean for them personally as they're going through their journey?
Well, initially, I just to preface this, I've worked with criminal clients for over 18 years. I'm in my 19th year. So I am used to them sometimes having very negative responses to being mandated into treatment on the front end. So that is a common thing that we deal with in our field. That said, overwhelmingly, when clients come to a place of successful completion, they're very thankful for the intervention. They're thankful for the time. They often speak to the fact that they would not have done it. They would not have chosen therapy like this for themselves if the court hadn't indeed mandated them into it. So if we just start there, they're usually not very receptive. I think another thing to preface this with is I specifically work with high-risk folks. So I see people at the level C side of the original DVRNA, what will probably be levels 3, 4, or 5 in the Cascade. And they need the highest amount of treatment, usually 2 or 3 treatment contacts per week. They're not happy about that. And I remember, if I can, just kind of cutting to the heart of your question, when I think back to when I was an early clinician, learning how to just do general criminogenic needs assessments, long before I ever stepped foot in domestic violence work. I had a hard time as a young therapist mandating more than 2 treatment contacts for people. It made me uncomfortable, like I was punishing them or that I was, giving them too high of a consequence that they wouldn't be able to financially afford. I really struggled with this as a young clinician, and I had very good supervisors who were trained in R&R, teaching me all along that if I fail to assess for the right level of risk, I actually set them up for relapses, for other failures, for not taking the treatment seriously, and for indeed maybe engaging in attrition and just dropping out. It was a hard lesson to learn that I remember from a long time ago in my career, and now I sit as a supervisor in the domestic violence world, teaching my new clinicians the same thing. We have to get the dosing right. They're going to complain, they're going to be upset about it, but getting that dosing right is actually the thing that ensures their success. That's a really hard thing for people to see when you don't do this work, probably for 19 years. Where you can see those patterns sort of play out. But it was a lesson long in coming, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And you touched on something else that I know that the office is really engaged in. And while I've got you, I'm going to take advantage of it. How can we continue to bring in the right clinicians into this space to make sure that we have the appropriate providers to support those in our community that need these services?
Well, that is a whole other milestone that we could address, but just to be
like I said, Aaron, I wanted this to be easy for you. I keep
So another milestone, seriously, that the DVOMB, I think, has put a lot of efforts into has been around provider recruitment. And I think that if we approached this as just trying to get more bodies in the field, then we would have just looked at, like recruitment incentives and trying to get information out there. I think that the DVOMB did a really important thing by enlisting, a company to research this, Orange Circle, and really delve into what is going on with attrition and recruitment and how can we entice people to want to do this work. And I think one of the things that really jumped out at all of us who have been involved in the Orange Circle projects and recruitment has been that the thing that draws us to this work is meaning and purpose, trying to do something about violence assistance, coercive controlled assistance, like actually trying to help people live better lives and have better relationships, that's really what's driving the motives of the people that do this work. And speaking to that when it's hard work, when it's sometimes undercompensated, when it is so requiring of skill and expertise and then not adequately compensated, to really be driven by purpose is one of the most important things about doing this work. And so in terms of drawing the right people to it, it's people, I think, who have a passion for some of these concepts, like reducing recidivism, safer communities, caring about the victims on the other side of things, actually trying to reduce violence in people's relationships and watch them improve their relationships. So I guess one thing I can say in closing to that is, having done a lot of other work with mental health and substance use work, which I'm still passionate about, but the reason I'm so driven to work with violence specifically is when you get the result, when you see people start to use more effective conflict resolution tools and they're more connected to the people in their lives and they've stopped using violence as a problem-solving strategy, it's so clear when it starts working. And so that payoff, watching that actually change in people, is the thing that keeps me doing it.
That's so wonderful to hear, and thanks so much for sharing that. I want to bring Jessica into the conversation. Jessica, as a victim advocate and board member, your role is kind of a check and balance in a way. Why is the treatment victim advocate so critical to this process? And how have the recent updates from your perspective to the standards and guidelines strengthened community safety for those who are survivors of domestic violence?
Such a big question. Thank you for asking that. I think I'm in the same boat as Aaron, that I trained for hours on this topic, so I'll try to be succinct. I mean, the TVA is, one of the required members of the multidisciplinary team, as we all know. But I mean, that relationship, the provider and the probation officer, and that collaborative effort is really a key component to victim safety and creating that community safety. And then, of course, offender treatment. So I guess just thinking about the way that it's evolved, participation from the victim is entirely voluntary. Victims retain full control over what is shared, if any. Regardless of their engagement, though, the TVA is able to convey the victim's voice and offer the offender treatment provider and probation officer critical information and sometimes an overlooked viewpoint in that extensive work that the probation officer and the treatment provider do to address offender behavior. I think victim voice can be lost a little bit. And so having that additional lens in there to balance all of it out and just say, hey, like, this is victim impact. This is maybe what we're seeing. This maybe needs to be addressed more. Really just kind of gives it that full circle for everybody to be involved. And of course, we're taking information in from the treatment provider and the probation officer and using that as well. Sometimes that helps us create more safety for the victim that we're working with, just to understand where that person is in treatment and maybe some risk that's involved. I think everybody is working diligently in their role. And so if we all do it well, then offender, we have effective offender treatment, risk reduction, and we have victim safety in mind, the community benefits. Like, it's just so imperative to have all three of those people at the table. And then, I think in a lot of the work we do, if there's any other professionals that are involved, we ask that they come to the table too. I think in my work, collaboration has become just the center of everything I do. I am a victim advocate, but I have multiple roles. And I think having that component of collaboration is the most magical thing to see. I think, Erin was referencing it earlier, that when you see things work, when you see improvement happen on the treatment side, and then you see our victim regaining their power and feeling like they can take back control of their life, and feeling as though they are being heard, and they get to go and do what they need to do, and our offender that's getting treatment is improving and getting it. I think that keeps me at the table every single day. So I could talk all day long about how imperative the TVA role is and what we do, but really getting to support that victim directly, crisis management, safety planning, resource navigation, and then also getting to collaborate with the team to make sure the offender treatment is effective and really benefits all involved, including the community, is, I think, the best model that I've seen yet. So.
Well, that's great to hear. And one of the things that we often talk about in the public safety space is taking these holistic approaches to the challenges that we're facing. And you touched on this a bit with having the right people at the table. Can you talk maybe a little bit about, from your perspective, what it means for victims in this space when they have kind of this holistic approach where everybody's kind of singing off the same sheet of music? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what it means to victims is empowerment at the end of the day, right? I think, the offender treatment is rooted in accountability. Victim treatment is rooted in empowerment. So being able to balance those two and have them happen at the same time is the most effective way of doing things. I say it all the time that the fastest way to create victim safety, the most effective, is effective and supportive offender treatment. I can plan with victims all day long on how to respond to issues of safety, to domestic violence, to abuse, to acts of violence. But realistically, at the end of the day, what needs to happen is offender treatment. So my work as a victim advocate, being able to be in this space and say, hey, this is what needs to happen, is actually the best way to impact my survivors' ability to move on, feel empowered, and get safety. And we've made a lot of changes to 7.0. I know you asked that earlier, but we've made a lot of changes to 7.0 to reflect that. One of them, and I'll just touch on this quickly, but it is confidentiality. TVAs didn't carry confidentiality. We were stuck in limbo between community advocates and system advocates. And the impact of changing to a confidentiality of a community advocate has allowed us as advocates to dig in and really give that deep integrated work with our survivors so that we can access whatever they need to and get them to the spaces that they need to, while also having a more effective role on the team. So all of it impacts victims, but at the end of the day, it's empowerment.
One of the things that I often think about is, how do we address misconceptions in various systems? I think sometimes the barrier for folks, regardless of what public safety topic we're discussing, one of the biggest barriers can be people's misconception of the system or the process or the people involved. From your perspective, what misconceptions do you frequently hear from survivors in this space? And how do we as a state move forward to further reduce those misconceptions or to provide better education? Or
the hardest battle that we fight is, and I think it's been referenced by others, is just that, the variation of the education of different professionals within the system. It's all along a spectrum. We're encountering professionals that have maybe no training or all the training. And I think the mixture of that level of expertise within the system is the most challenging thing for survivors to access and navigate, realistically speaking. And the system is built around offenders. Obviously it's meant to. We're looking at what they've done and how to handle it and how to rehabilitate and treat and all of those things. And victims, I don't want to say are a side note, because Colorado has done such an amazing job of integrating victim services into the process. But I think and I don't even know if it's a misconception, but just kind of that the system is built around offenders and they don't know how to navigate it. So, I think if I were to wave a magic wand somewhere, it would be that we would have access to really solid, adequate training for everyone that interacts with offenders and victims across the state. I think that the number one thing that I spend with survivors on is language. When I'm offering education and support, it's how do you speak to professionals so that you not only eloquently tell them what is happening to you and give them direct language so they understand regardless of where their training is, but how do you ask for help in a way that helps them understand what to do? And that is a lot to ask of a victim who's in crisis, right? To say, when you're interacting with, these particular people out in the system, what are you going to say and how are you going to say it? How are you going to effectively communicate that this is domestic violence, particularly in incidents where violence, like physical violence, hasn't occurred, but there's a lot of other things happening that the system is limited in what they can do about. So, I know that that's kind of a side answer to your question, but I think there is a pie in the sky ideal that we have all this access to victim services, so victims are taken care of. However, even as basic as people may not understand the different roles of different advocates, right? That they go to a sheriff's office advocate and then a victim specialist at the DA's office, and then they're working with a VSO and a TBA, and all of those people have different levels of confidentiality, different levels of services and what they can do. That alone is something that people don't understand. So there's a lot, but I hope that answers your question a little bit. I'm trying to stay focused.
No, it does answer it, Jessica. And I think we could spend a whole couple hours just talking about the different victim advocates in the space. I think we could also spend a lot of time. I've often been surprised by, and you mentioned this, that we can have a lot of services in the system, but at the same time, we can have significant gaps or have significant barriers to access, and understanding the needs of somebody who's going through something like this and the availability of those resources. We could spend a lot of time. We're running out of time.
Yeah, I know.
So what I'll do is, to wrap this up, this work can be in a way deeply technical as it relates to standards and implementing standards. But the goal is really this human goal, right? To improve outcomes for everyone in the system. Jesse, Stephanie, Aaron, and Jessica, just if you had 30 seconds, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds. So what is the one thing you'd like the public to understand about the board, the standards, or the system as a whole that maybe we haven't touched on, or that you really would like to drive home? And I'll go in reverse order. So starting with Jessica.
I would say, and that's such a hard question. I was thinking about it before, but I think understanding the human component about the work that we do, I would really want people to understand that the board is centered around victim safety, and its mission is around victim safety. It's increasing safety for the victims and within the communities, ensuring offenders are held accountable with evidence-based intervention, and risk reduction is really where we're at. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about it's treatment, it's rehabilitation. But at the end of the day, we are actually focused on victim safety. We're reducing harm, and it's one person at a time that we're changing our communities, and that is very hard work. It is often underpaid, I think, as what Aaron said, and the human aspect to it would be understanding that we're literally stepping into a pool of people that need that support, and we're helping one person at a time, one victim, one offender, and we're reducing risk. That is our job, and we come in on a ladder and we can only do so much, but hopefully we work our way up our ladder and they walk away with more tools and a safer family.
I love that. It's the idea of, we're working on these system-wide changes, but at the end of the day, it's individuals and the individual approach to these folks. All right, Aaron, you're up.
The thing that I want to say that I feel like my purpose today didn't touch on is there's a reason the rest of the country is looking to us. I just recently was at the National Batterers Intervention Conference in Michigan and exposed to a whole bunch of providers from all over the country. And there's just a couple things that I think people know we're different. They often cite Colorado as the gold standard, but what really stood out to me there is that half of the country isn't even doing assessment. So they're not following R&R. So they were really curious about the cascade. They think it sounds really interesting. And then it's crazy that much of the country is trying to treat DV with this one size fits all approach and just throwing everybody in regardless of risk. That's huge. The other thing is we have this system endorsed support by having an organized board and being connected to the legislature and then incorporating everything from, probation and ComCore all the way up to DOC. We have created coordinated community responses. So this concept of CCRs is big elsewhere in the country. We have sort of a system mandated one that's endorsed by our DVOMB, and that helps facilitate this MTT concept. I think that's integral. And then the third piece being something Jesse spoke to, that we have standards across the state that you know what to expect with regards to this treatment, and that all of our data collection here in this state and all of those mandates under our legislature have demonstrated what we're doing is working. So there's a reason people are looking to us. We're addressing all those pieces of R&R and it is working. And so I feel really good about that. I feel really good about being the provider here and really good about participating in the board and doing so much work for it. It's my favorite thing I do, even though I do it for free.
Ditto.
Well, we certainly appreciate that, Aaron. And I was half joking, but just last week I was talking with a funder for a particular project, and I was selling them on why they should choose Colorado to try this new innovative program. And I said it's part of our DNA. We do so many new and innovative things here in Colorado, and it's the greatest state in the union. Why would you not pick Colorado? So I appreciate you touching on that. And Stephanie, 30 seconds. What's one thing you want people to better understand?
Victim safety is incredibly important to me, and victim safety is at the heart of everything that the board does. And the board spends a lot of time reviewing research and refining the standards so that they reflect these best practices. And it ensures that at the core of domestic violence is coercive control, which isn't always reflected in the statute, but it ensures that this is being addressed in treatment. And it helps judges and prosecutors know that the treatment that offenders are getting works, and that ensures consistent decision making and ultimately creates a safer environment and outcomes for survivors.
Well, wonderful. And Jesse, you get to bring it home. What's one thing you'd like folks to know as we wrap up here?
Well, Matt, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few final thoughts. As evidence today, DV is a very complex crime that has a lot of nuances and requires a lot of specialized expertise, as you could hear from the wonderful folks who participated in our podcast. I think what I'm proud of in the work that the board has done is that having the infrastructure there allows us to be a problem-solving board in responding to a variety of different crises. When we had the pandemic, we were able to quickly respond to allowing providers to move to virtual settings so that there wasn't a destabilization of clients who weren't able to go to treatment. And not every state has that. They don't have the ability of a board to pivot or be able to respond to research or respond to case law. And that infrastructure goes a long way. And so my main point that I wanted to say, in addition to it being a problem-solving board, is the volunteerism aspect, I think, is really something that it goes unnoticed. And, Aaron mentioned it, Jessica mentioned it, that they're dedicating their time to this function. And I think for us to be a problem-solving board, to have these accomplishments, they're a reflection of our board members. And so when you go to our website, when you see our standards, when you interact with our trainings, there's a reflection point for each one of our board members who have dedicated their time to this, because the staff couldn't do this alone. And so them being part of this is so impactful. And for them to be here, be representative of their different fields, it gives hope to those who might be coming after them, that, my time on a board isn't just going to be sitting around a room looking at each other, that we're actually going to have meaningful conversations and really address challenges that are hopefully going to impact public safety in the way that we hope. That's what I wanted to share. Is just the point about volunteerism is really important to our work. Very thankful for our board members.
Well, thank you so much for highlighting that. And thank you to our panel for your incredible insights and for the work that you do each and every day to protect everyone who calls Colorado home. Thanks so much for joining us. We are just getting started, and we look forward to bringing you more stories, interviews, and discussions that highlight the incredible work being done in our communities to build a stronger, safer Colorado. If you enjoyed today's episode, help us increase awareness by sharing and subscribing to this podcast. Together, we can continue to drive change and create a brighter future for everyone. Until next time, stay safe and stay engaged.